Nothing prepares you for the moment you realize strangers have been making money from land your family owned before they were even born. The tires of my truck crunched across the gravel road as I climbed the last hill overlooking my uncle's ranch. The late afternoon sun hung low over the Texas horizon, turning the grasslands gold and casting long shadows across the valley below. I had not been back in nearly 6 years. Life had a way of pulling people in different directions, and after my Uncle Jack passed away, returning to the ranch became something I kept postponing. Then the attorney called. The inheritance paperwork was finalized. The ranch was mine. 4,700 acres of rolling pasture, oak groves, stock ponds, and rocky hills that had belonged to the Harper family for more than 80 years. I remember gripping the steering wheel tighter as I reached the crest of the hill. The smell of dry grass drifted through the open window. A warm breeze carried the distant sound of wind chimes and laughter. At first, I thought I was hearing things. My uncle's ranch had always been quiet. The kind of place where the loudest sounds were cattle moving through the pasture or coyotes calling after sunset. But this sounded different. Human. Busy. Almost festive. Then I saw them. My truck rolled to a stop. I just sat there staring. Down in the valley, where there should have been open grazing land, stood a row of wooden cabins. Not 1 or 2 cabins. At least a dozen. Fresh timber walls. Metal roofs glinting in the sunlight. Gravel parking areas. Outdoor fire pits. Picnic tables. There were SUVs parked everywhere. Families walked between cabins carrying coolers and bags. Children ran through the grass. Smoke drifted from barbecue grills. It looked less like a ranch and more like a vacation resort. For several seconds, I honestly wondered if I had taken the wrong road. Then I looked toward the old windmill standing near the creek. The same windmill my grandfather built in the 1960s. The same one I used to climb when I was young enough to think I was invincible. It was still there, which meant I was exactly where I thought I was. The cabins were the part that did not belong. I grabbed the property map from the passenger seat and unfolded it across the steering wheel. The paper crackled beneath my hands. The legal survey lines were clear. The cabin sat well inside the ranch boundary. Not near the edge. Not in a disputed corner. Directly on Harper family land. My stomach tightened. I drove farther down the hill, passing beneath a large wooden sign mounted beside the entrance road. The fresh paint looked almost new. Bold letters stretched across the front. Willow Pines, HOA Vacation Retreat. I read the sign twice. Then a third time. The letters did not magically change. An HOA. Not only had someone built cabins on ranch property, they were openly operating them as a business. The parking lot was nearly full. A woman carrying luggage smiled and waved as I drove past. Another family unloaded fishing gear near one of the cabins. Nobody acted like they were trespassing. Nobody seemed nervous. They behaved like they had every right to be there. That bothered me more than anything. This operation had clearly existed for a while. Long enough for guests to trust it. Long enough for somebody to make serious money. I parked near the edge of the property and stepped out of the truck. The air smelled of cedar wood, charcoal smoke, and fresh-cut grass. Somewhere nearby, music played softly from a portable speaker. The entire scene felt surreal. My uncle never mentioned cabins. The attorney never mentioned cabins. The county records never mentioned cabins. Yet there they were, standing in plain sight. As the sun settled lower behind the hills, I looked across the valley toward the cabins scattered across land my family had owned for generations. Somebody had built them. Somebody had approved them. Somebody had been collecting rent from them. And standing there in the fading light, with the sign of an HOA retreat staring back at me, I realized inheriting my uncle's ranch was about to become far more complicated than anyone had warned me. The first night back at the ranch, I barely slept. The old house creaked the same way it had when I was a kid. Wind brushed against the windows. Somewhere outside, a loose piece of metal tapped rhythmically against the barn roof. Normally those sounds would have been comforting. Instead, my mind kept returning to the cabins. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw rows of rental units sitting on Harper land as if they had always belonged there. By sunrise, the smell of coffee filled the kitchen. Golden light spilled across the worn hardwood floor while dust drifted through the air. My Uncle Jack had lived alone in that house for nearly 20 years. He was the kind of man who fixed everything himself. If a fence broke, he repaired it. If a water pump failed, he rebuilt it. He never trusted strangers with his land, which made the cabins even harder to understand. After breakfast, I stepped outside and looked across the ranch. The property stretched toward the horizon in every direction. Oak trees lined the creek beds. Cattle grazed in distant pastures. The same hills that had surrounded my childhood stood unchanged against the Texas sky. This land carried generations of memories. My grandfather bought the original acreage shortly after returning from military service. My father was raised here. My uncle spent most of his life protecting it. Growing up, every holiday seemed to happen somewhere on the ranch. Family cookouts beside the pond, fishing trips before sunrise, long horseback rides through the western pasture. The place was more than property. It was part of our family identity. That was why my uncle's death hit harder than I expected. We were never the type of family that talked every week. But he was always there. Quiet, reliable, steady. When the attorney called and informed me that I had inherited everything, I felt honored and overwhelmed at the same time. Managing nearly 5,000 acres was not a small responsibility. Yet none of the legal paperwork mentioned cabins. None of the estate documents mentioned vacation rentals. None of the tax records mentioned an HOA operation. Around mid-morning, I drove toward the main ranch entrance to inspect the property more closely. The gravel road curved through rolling grassland before descending toward the area where the cabins stood. As I approached, activity was already underway. Guests carried luggage between vehicles and cabins. A family unloaded fishing rods near a small pond. Someone pushed a cart stacked with fresh linens. The smell of cedar lumber mixed with coffee and breakfast cooking on outdoor grills. The entire place operated like a professional resort. What struck me most was how permanent everything looked. Fresh landscaping surrounded the cabins. Decorative signs pointed guests toward hiking trails. New fencing enclosed sections of land. Somebody had invested serious money into this operation. I parked near a cluster of oak trees and watched for several minutes. Then I noticed something else. Several maps posted near the check-in area displayed property boundaries. According to those maps, the cabin sat entirely within Willow Pines HOA recreational land. I knew that was impossible. The ranch survey in my truck showed otherwise. Yet every guest arriving here would naturally believe the signs. Why would they not? The signs looked official, professional, convincing. A cold feeling settled in my stomach. This was not a recent mistake. This was something that had been operating long enough for people to accept it as truth. On my way back to the house, I stopped at the old horse barn. The large wooden doors groaned as I pulled them open. The familiar smell of hay, leather, and aged timber filled the air. Sunlight streamed through narrow gaps in the walls. Most of the equipment remained exactly where my uncle left it. Saddles hung from hooks. Feed bins lined one wall. Dust covered tools that had not been touched in months. Then my eyes landed on something near the rear corner of the barn. An old steel safe. I remembered it immediately. Growing up, I had asked my uncle dozens of times what he kept inside. He always smiled and changed the subject. Looking at it now, surrounded by decades of family history, I could not shake the feeling that whatever answers existed about the cabins, the ranch, and everything that had happened while my uncle was alive might be hidden much closer than I realized. The next morning, I decided it was time to stop observing and start asking questions. The sky was clear, and the Texas sun had already begun warming the valley by the time I drove back toward the cabin area. The place was even busier than the day before. Pickup trucks, SUVs, and rental vans filled the gravel lots. Guests carried coolers toward fishing spots while others gathered around outdoor picnic tables. The smell of bacon and coffee drifted through the air. Everything looked polished, organized, and profitable. A large wooden welcome center sat near the entrance, decorated with flower beds and professionally printed signs advertising weekend retreats, guided trail rides, and family vacation packages. The more I looked around, the harder it became to believe none of this had ever appeared in my uncle's estate records. I parked and walked toward the welcome center. Inside, a young employee greeted me with a practiced smile. Behind her, framed photographs displayed happy families enjoying the cabins throughout different seasons. Summer fishing tournaments, fall festivals, holiday events. This operation had clearly existed for years. I introduced myself and casually asked who managed the property. The smile on her face faded slightly. "That would be the Willow Pines Homeowners Association," she said. Then she gave me a business card. Printed across the front was a name. Linda Prescott, HOA President. I slipped the card into my pocket and thanked her before leaving. About an hour later, I found myself standing inside the Willow Pines Community Clubhouse. The building overlooked a small lake surrounded by expensive homes. Everything felt carefully maintained. Fresh landscaping bordered the entrance. Decorative stonework lined the walkways. Inside, the air smelled faintly of coffee, polished wood, and expensive candles. Residents moved through the lobby carrying folders and chatting about community events. Near the far end of the building stood a woman speaking with several board members. Even before anyone introduced her, I knew exactly who she was. Linda Prescott carried herself with the confidence of someone accustomed to being in charge. She appeared to be in her mid-50s, dressed in a tailored blazer that probably cost more than my first truck. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled, and she smiled constantly, though something about the smile felt calculated. When she noticed me approaching, she immediately shifted her attention toward me. "Can I help you?" she asked politely. I introduced myself. The moment I mentioned the Harper Ranch, her expression changed almost imperceptibly. Most people would have missed it. I did not. The smile remained, but her eyes narrowed for a fraction of a second. "Ah," she said. "Jack Harper's nephew." The fact that she already knew exactly who I was surprised me. "You knew my uncle?" I asked. "Everyone around here knew Jack," she replied. "He kept mostly to himself." Then she quickly changed the subject. "What brings you to Willow Pines today?" I explained that I was reviewing the property after inheriting the ranch. I mentioned the cabins. Her response came almost instantly. "The cabins have been part of the community for years." She spoke with complete confidence. Not uncertainty, not hesitation. Confidence. "The land issues were resolved a long time ago." Land issues. The phrase immediately caught my attention. She said it as though there had once been questions, but no longer any answers worth discussing. I asked what exactly she meant. Her smile returned. "Old boundary matters. Nothing important." Then she glanced toward a nearby board member, as if signaling the conversation should end. Before walking away, she offered one final piece of advice. "You might find it easier not to dig too deeply into old paperwork, Mr. Harper. Sometimes history creates more confusion than clarity." I watched her disappear into another meeting room. The entire exchange lasted less than 5 minutes, but it told me everything I needed to know. Linda Prescott was not surprised to see me. She was not curious about my inheritance. She was not concerned about the ranch. She expected me to accept her explanation and move on. More importantly, she wanted me to stop asking questions. That alone guaranteed I would keep asking them. As I stepped outside, a warm breeze rippled across the lake. Sunlight reflected off the water while vacation guests laughed near the shoreline. From a distance, Willow Pines looked peaceful, successful, perfectly normal. But beneath that carefully maintained image, something felt wrong. And for the first time since returning to the ranch, I became convinced my uncle knew exactly what was happening long before he died. Over the next several days, I stopped treating the situation like a misunderstanding and started treating it like an investigation. Every morning, I drove into town and spent hours digging through public records. The county clerk's office became my second home. The building smelled like old paper, printer toner, and dust that had settled into filing cabinets over decades. I reviewed property maps, tax assessments, survey records, and historical filings connected to both the ranch and Willow Pines. The deeper I looked, the stranger things became. Some records clearly showed the original Harper Ranch boundaries exactly as I remembered them. Other documents seemed to suggest different property lines altogether. Certain maps included notes that did not appear anywhere else. It felt like I was looking at pieces from multiple puzzles mixed together. One afternoon, while comparing surveys from different years, I noticed something unusual. A survey from nearly 15 years earlier referenced a boundary adjustment review. The review itself was missing. There was a reference number. There was a filing date. There was even a notation indicating supporting documents existed. But the actual documents were gone. Not misplaced. Gone. I asked a county employee about it. She searched the archive system twice before shaking her head. "That file should be here," she said. "I cannot explain why it is not." That answer stayed with me the entire drive back to the ranch. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the grasslands as I followed the gravel road home. Somewhere beyond the hills, guests were still checking into cabins built on Harper land. Families were roasting marshmallows beside fire pits. Vacationers were paying nightly rental fees. And every day the operation remained active, somebody continued making money from property they did not own. The realization became harder to ignore. That evening, I parked near one of the cabin areas and watched from a distance. The place looked busy. More guests had arrived for the weekend. Decorative lanterns lined walking paths. String lights glowed between trees. A wooden sign advertised guided horseback tours despite the fact that the horses involved belonged to a local contractor, not the HOA. The entire business had been carefully packaged to create the impression of a rustic ranch experience. The irony almost made me laugh. They were selling visitors a version of ranch life while operating on land that had never legally belonged to them. As darkness settled over the valley, I noticed another detail. Near the Welcome Center stood a display board showing rates, occupancy schedules, and upcoming events. Curious, I walked closer. According to the posted calendar, most weekends were fully booked months in advance. Fishing retreats, family reunions, corporate getaways, seasonal festivals. The place was generating serious revenue, much more than I initially assumed. Standing there beneath the glow of outdoor lights, I began wondering where all that money was going. The next morning brought another surprise. While reviewing online listings for the cabins, I discovered promotional materials stretching back years. Hundreds of photographs, guest reviews, advertising campaigns, social media pages. Every piece of marketing identified the cabins as a Willow Pines HOA amenity. Yet nowhere could I find a single reference explaining how the HOA acquired the land. No purchase records, no deed transfers, no ownership history. It was as if everyone simply accepted that the cabins belonged there because they had existed for so long. Later that afternoon, I received an unexpected visit. A local surveyor named Ben Crawford pulled into the ranch driveway. My uncle had hired him several times over the years. After introducing himself, he glanced toward the distant cabin area and sighed. "Jack knew there would be trouble eventually," he said. Those words immediately got my attention. We sat on the porch while the evening breeze moved through the oak trees. Ben explained that my uncle spent years disputing certain property assumptions surrounding the cabins. According to Ben, Jack never believed the boundaries had changed. He just struggled to prove it because older records became increasingly difficult to locate. He kept looking, Ben said quietly, right up until the end. The sun dipped below the horizon as those words settled in my mind. My uncle had known something was wrong. He had spent years trying to protect the ranch. And somehow, before he could finish what he started, the trail went cold. As darkness covered the valley, I looked toward the old barn where the steel safe still sat untouched. For the second time in less than a week, my attention returned to that safe. Because if my uncle spent years searching for answers, there was a very good chance he left something behind for the person who would continue the fight after him. The next morning, I finally turned my attention to the steel safe. Sunlight streamed through the gaps in the barn walls, filling the interior with narrow beams of gold. Dust drifted lazily through the air while the familiar smell of hay, leather, and old wood surrounded me. The safe sat exactly where it had been for as long as I could remember, tucked into a corner behind shelves filled with tools and supplies. My Uncle Jack rarely talked about it. Whenever I asked what was inside, he would grin, tell me it contained boring paperwork, and change the subject. Standing there now, I was beginning to suspect the paperwork was anything but boring. After searching through drawers inside the ranch house, I found a small envelope tucked inside my uncle's desk. Written across the front in his unmistakable handwriting were 3 simple words. "For coal only." My pulse quickened as I opened it. Inside was a key and a folded note. The note contained only a single sentence. "If the cabins are still there, start here." I stared at the words for several seconds. The cabins. Not if cabins appeared. Not if someone built cabins. If the cabins are still there. My uncle had known. For years. Maybe longer. I returned to the barn and unlocked the safe. The heavy door swung open with a metallic groan. Inside sat several binders, document boxes, and sealed envelopes organized with surprising precision. Everything was labeled by year. Everything looked intentional. It was not the collection of random papers I expected. It was an archive, a carefully preserved record of something my uncle never wanted lost. I carried the first box back to the ranch house and spread the contents across the dining room table. The smell of aged paper filled the room. Survey maps, property deeds, tax assessments, correspondence with county officials. engineering reports, decades of documentation. For hours, I sorted through the material while the afternoon sun slowly crossed the room. Then I found the first major clue. A certified land survey dated 1978. The map was detailed and professionally prepared. Every boundary marker was clearly identified. Every corner of the property was measured and documented. Most importantly, the cabin area sat well within the Harper Ranch boundary. Not near the edge. Not within a disputed section. Directly inside family-owned land. I compared the survey to newer maps from the county records office. The differences were impossible to ignore. At some point, later documents began depicting the area differently. Not dramatically, just enough to create confusion. Just enough to raise questions. I continued digging. Another folder contained photographs. Hundreds of them. Fence lines, creek crossings, survey markers, tree clusters, utility easements. My uncle had photographed nearly every significant feature on the ranch over multiple decades. Some images included handwritten notes identifying exact locations and dates. It felt less like a photo collection and more like evidence. Then I opened a thick binder labeled Boundary Dispute. My uncle had spent years documenting conversations, meetings, and correspondence related to the property. Several letters referenced concerns about expanding recreational development near the ranch boundary. Others discussed requests for access, easements, and land use permissions that had apparently been denied. One document immediately caught my attention. It was a letter from my uncle to the county, written nearly 9 years earlier. In it, he explicitly stated that certain structures associated with willow pines appeared to be located on Harper property. He requested a formal review. Attached to the letter was proof of delivery. The county received it. Yet somehow the issue never seemed to reach a conclusion. As evening approached, I found the most important item so far. A sealed envelope marked original deed copy. Inside was a pristine copy of the ranch deed along with supporting legal descriptions dating back generations. The language was precise. The boundaries were unmistakable. Every acre containing the cabins remained part of the ranch. I leaned back in my chair and looked out the window toward the distant hills. The sky glowed orange as sunset approached. Down in the valley, guests were probably checking into cabins again. Families were unpacking luggage. Vacationers were enjoying a weekend retreat. None of them knew the land beneath those cabins had a very different history than the brochures claimed. For the first time since arriving at the ranch, I no longer felt confused. I felt certain. My uncle had not spent years chasing rumors. He had spent years preserving proof. And sitting on the table in front of me was enough evidence to suggest the truth was far bigger than a simple boundary mistake. The following week became a lesson in just how much money people can make when nobody questions ownership. Armed with the documents from my uncle's safe, I shifted my focus away from boundaries and toward business records. Every cabin had a name. Every cabin had an online listing. Every listing led somewhere. Sitting at the ranch house late into the night, surrounded by stacks of paperwork and old survey maps, I began tracing the operation piece by piece. The glow of my laptop illuminated the dining room, while crickets chirped outside beneath the Texas sky. Reservation websites showed years of guest reviews. Vacation rental platforms displayed occupancy calendars stretching months into the future. Promotional videos highlighted fishing, hiking, stargazing, and authentic ranch experiences. The marketing was impressive. The problem was that the ranch being advertised belonged to my family. By the third day, I had assembled a timeline covering nearly a decade of rental activity. The cabins were rarely empty. Holiday weekends sold out months in advance. Seasonal events attracted visitors from multiple states. Corporate retreats rented entire sections of the property. Every new record pointed toward the same conclusion. This was not a small community project. It was a thriving business. One afternoon, I drove into town and met with a local accountant recommended by Ben Crawford. We sat inside a quiet office overlooking the courthouse square while ceiling fans turned lazily overhead. I showed him publicly available records, tax filings connected to community operations, and promotional materials tied to the cabins. He reviewed everything carefully before leaning back in his chair. If occupancy was anywhere near what these listings suggest, he said, tapping a stack of papers, we are talking about substantial revenue. He never offered an exact number because we lacked complete records. He did not need to. The implication was obvious. Somebody had earned a significant amount of money from structures sitting on Harper land. Driving back to the ranch, I kept thinking about my uncle. The more evidence I uncovered, the clearer his actions became. He was not obsessing over old boundary disputes. He was following a trail connected to land, money, and years of unanswered questions. Later that evening, I returned to the safe and opened another box I had not fully examined. Inside were folders organized by date. One folder contained printed screenshots from rental advertisements going back years. Another contained photographs showing the gradual expansion of the cabin operation. What started as a few isolated structures eventually became an organized resort-style destination. My uncle had documented everything: dates, locations, construction phases, new roads, new parking areas. He had watched the operation grow while preserving a record of every step. Then I found a notebook. The cover was worn and faded from use. Inside were handwritten entries spanning several years. Most were short observations: occupancy levels, new cabin additions, changes to signage, mentions of meetings and conversations. One entry stopped me cold. It described a conversation with an HOA representative who allegedly claimed the cabin business generated enough income to fund major community projects. I read the note twice, then a third time. Suddenly, the entire situation looked different. This was not merely a case of structures sitting in the wrong location. The cabins had become financially important. Important enough that people might have strong incentives to avoid questions about ownership. As sunset approached, I drove to a ridge overlooking the valley. Below me, guests moved between cabins while porch lights flickered on one by one. Smoke rose from barbecue grills. Children chased fireflies through the grass. The scene appeared peaceful, almost picturesque. None of the visitors seemed aware that a serious question hovered beneath everything around them. They were renting cabins in good faith. They believed the operation was legitimate because every sign, brochure, and website told them it was. Looking across the valley, I realized something else. If the ownership documents in my uncle's safe were accurate, then every reservation, every rental payment, and every advertisement had been built upon a foundation that deserved far closer scrutiny. And for the first time since inheriting the ranch, I felt like I was no longer chasing the truth. I was catching up to it. By the beginning of the following month, I had enough evidence to stop searching and start proving. The ranch house looked more like a research office than a home. Survey maps covered the dining table. Historical photographs filled entire sections of the living room floor. Binders from my uncle's safe sat stacked beside county records and printed rental listings. Every document pointed in the same direction. The only thing missing was a modern verification that connected the past to the present in a way nobody could dispute. That was where Ben Crawford came back into the picture. One cool morning before sunrise, his survey truck rolled into the ranch driveway. The smell of damp grass drifted through the air while a thin layer of fog rested across the lower pastures. Ben stepped out carrying equipment cases and rolled maps beneath one arm. 2 additional survey technicians followed behind him. They spent the next several hours unloading instruments and reviewing historical records from the safe. When Ben saw the original 1978 survey, he let out a low whistle. "This is exactly what we needed," he said. For the next 3 days, the survey team worked across the property. They located old markers my grandfather had installed decades earlier. Some remained exactly where the historical documents said they should be. Others were hidden beneath brush, dirt, and years of neglect. Every discovery strengthened the chain of evidence. The process fascinated me. Tiny metal markers buried in the ground carried more authority than years of assumptions and rumors. Facts remained facts whether people liked them or not. On the 4th afternoon, I accompanied Ben to a ridge overlooking the cabin area. The sky was bright blue, and the valley below looked almost like a travel brochure. Families walked between cabins. Guests sat on porches drinking coffee. Children tossed footballs across open grass. Nobody seemed aware that survey crews were quietly changing the future of the entire operation. Ben finished reviewing his measurements and slowly lowered his equipment. Then he looked at me. "Cole," he said, "there is no ambiguity here." I already knew what he was about to say. Every single cabin sits on ranch property. Even though I expected the answer, hearing it spoken aloud felt different. Final, certain, real. We spent the rest of the afternoon documenting everything. Photographs, coordinates, Measurements. Reference points. By sunset, the survey package had grown into a thick collection of professionally verified records. As we packed equipment into the trucks, I looked across the valley toward the cabins. Porch lights were beginning to glow beneath the fading orange sky. Guests gathered around fire pits while smoke drifted lazily into the evening air. The entire business continued operating exactly as it had the week before. The difference was that now there could be no serious argument about where those structures actually stood. The following morning, I drove into town with copies of the survey results. The courthouse square buzzed with activity. People crossed sidewalks carrying coffee cups while traffic moved steadily through downtown streets. Inside the county offices, the atmosphere felt far less mysterious than during my earlier visits. This time I was not searching for answers. I was delivering them. Several officials reviewed the materials carefully. One employee spent nearly 20 minutes comparing the modern survey against historical records. Another examined photographs from my uncle's archive. Nobody offered dramatic reactions. They simply studied the evidence. Professional people tend to do that when presented with strong facts. Later that afternoon, news of the completed survey began spreading through the community. Phone calls were made. Meetings were scheduled. Questions started appearing that had never been asked before. For years, people discussed the cabins as though their existence settled every ownership question. Now ownership itself had become the question. As the sun disappeared behind the western hills that evening, I sat on the ranch porch watching shadows stretch across the pasture. Somewhere beyond the valley, Linda Prescott was almost certainly learning about the survey results. For the first time since inheriting the ranch, I felt something shift. Not in the land, not in the documents, in the balance of the story itself. My uncle had spent years preserving evidence because he believed the truth would matter someday. Sitting there beneath the fading Texas sky, I realized that someday had finally arrived. The reaction arrived faster than I expected. Within days of the survey being completed, the atmosphere around Willow Pines changed noticeably. The cheerful certainty that had surrounded the cabin operation for years began giving way to questions. Some came from residents. Others came from local officials. A few came from people directly connected to the rental business itself. The facts were no longer hidden inside old boxes in my uncle's safe. They existed in a modern survey backed by historical records, photographs, deeds, and decades of documentation. For the first time, people outside the ranch could see the same picture my uncle had spent years trying to preserve. One afternoon, I received notice that a special community meeting had been scheduled at the Willow Pines clubhouse. Attendance was expected to be unusually high. Word had spread quickly. Rumors always travel fast in small communities, but verified facts move even faster. By the time I arrived, the parking lot was packed. Luxury SUVs sat beside pickup trucks. Golf carts lined the entrance. Residents gathered in small groups beneath the evening sky discussing surveys, property lines, and legal records. The air smelled of freshly cut grass and warm pavement, still holding heat from the Texas sun. Inside, the clubhouse felt different from my first visit. Conversations were quieter. Smiles seemed more cautious. The confidence that once filled the room had been replaced by uncertainty. Linda Prescott stood near the front speaking with board members. When she saw me enter, her expression remained controlled, but it lacked the easy confidence I remembered from our earlier conversation. The meeting began with routine updates, community projects, budget discussions, maintenance schedules. Everyone knew those topics were not the reason the room was full. Eventually, a resident stood and asked the question hanging over the entire community. What is happening with the cabin property? The room fell silent. Linda adjusted a folder in front of her. Another board member attempted to answer. Then someone else asked about the survey. Another person mentioned ownership records. Within minutes, the discussion shifted entirely toward the cabins. I listened quietly from the back. The facts spoke for themselves. Historical surveys, original deeds, boundary markers, professional verification. Every question seemed to lead back to the same unavoidable reality. The structures existed on land that belonged to the ranch. As more residents spoke, another issue began emerging. People wanted to know how this happened. They wanted to know why questions raised years earlier never received clear answers. They wanted to know who approved decisions connected to the cabin operation. The discussion became increasingly uncomfortable for the board. Not hostile, not chaotic, simply difficult. Facts tend to create that effect when they remain ignored for too long. After nearly 2 hours, several residents requested independent review of records connected to the property. Others called for outside evaluation of agreements related to the cabins. Motions were proposed. Discussions followed. Votes were scheduled. The process moved forward exactly the way responsible governance is supposed to function when serious questions arise. As the meeting ended, people filed into the parking lot beneath a sky filled with stars. Groups lingered near their vehicles, continuing conversations that would likely last for weeks. Nobody seemed interested in vacation packages or retreat promotions anymore. Ownership had become the topic everyone wanted to discuss. Over the following days, additional reviews were initiated. Rental activities faced increasing scrutiny. Questions about property use, revenue, and authorization multiplied. The operation that once seemed untouchable suddenly found itself under a spotlight. Through it all, I kept thinking about my uncle. He never received the answers he deserved while he was alive, but he never stopped preserving the evidence. Every photograph, every survey, every note, every document. He built a record strong enough to survive long after he was gone. One evening, I stood on the ridge overlooking the valley once again. The cabins remained below, illuminated by porch lights as guests enjoyed another quiet night beneath the stars. Yet the atmosphere felt different now. The illusion of certainty had disappeared. The questions were finally being asked. And for the first time since inheriting the ranch, it felt like the truth was no longer fighting to be heard. It was beginning to win. The final chapter unfolded slowly, which somehow made it even more satisfying. There was no dramatic showdown on a courthouse staircase. No shouting match in a packed room. Just a steady sequence of facts reaching their inevitable conclusion. Over the next several months, independent reviews continued examining the records connected to the cabin operation. Historical surveys were compared against current boundaries. Original deeds were reviewed alongside county archives. Financial records connected to the rental business received closer scrutiny. Every step seemed to reinforce the same conclusion. The land beneath the cabins had always remained part of the Harper Ranch. By early spring, the uncertainty that once protected the situation had disappeared. Clear ownership records existed. Verified survey data existed. Decades of supporting documentation existed. The question was no longer whether the ranch owned the property. The question became how the situation would be corrected. One morning, I stood on the porch watching sunlight spread across the valley when my phone rang. It was Ben Crawford. His voice carried a hint of satisfaction. "The final review is complete," he said. I thanked him and looked toward the distant cabins. The grass had begun turning green again after winter. Wildflowers dotted sections of the pasture. From a distance, everything appeared peaceful. Yet I knew years of assumptions were finally coming to an end. During the following weeks, a series of agreements and corrective actions moved forward. Rental operations associated with the disputed area were suspended while ownership matters were formally resolved. Community leadership underwent significant changes. Several board positions became vacant. New elections were scheduled. Independent oversight measures were introduced to ensure future decisions received proper review. The process was not about punishment. It was about restoring order. That distinction mattered. Most residents of Willow Pines were not responsible for what happened. They simply trusted the information they had been given. Many of them later expressed surprise when they learned how much evidence had existed all along. Others admitted they never questioned the cabins because they assumed someone else had already done the homework. Human nature works that way. People tend to trust what appears established. A few months later, I attended one final community meeting. The atmosphere felt completely different from my first visit. Residents asked thoughtful questions. New board members discussed transparency and accountability. The focus had shifted away from defending old assumptions and toward building a better future. Linda Prescott attended as well. She sat quietly near the front of the room. Time has a way of changing people. The confidence that once filled every conversation had faded. When the meeting ended, she approached me briefly. For a moment, neither of us said anything. Then she looked toward the valley and nodded. "Jack never stopped fighting for that land, did he?" she asked. "No," I replied. "He did not." She stood silently for a few seconds before wishing me well and walking away. It was not a dramatic ending. It was something better. Acceptance. As spring turned into summer, the ranch slowly began feeling like home again. The old barn still smelled of hay and weathered wood. The windmill still turned above the creek. Cattle moved across the same pastures my grandfather once rode on horseback. Some of the cabins remained standing while long-term solutions were finalized through proper channels. Others were repurposed in ways consistent with lawful ownership and agreements. Most importantly, the land itself returned to the care of the family that had protected it for generations. One evening, nearly a year after I inherited the ranch, I climbed the same ridge where I first discovered the cabins. The sunset painted the sky in shades of orange and gold. A warm breeze moved through the grass while the valley stretched below me. I thought about my grandfather. I thought about my Uncle Jack. I thought about the safe hidden in the barn and the thousands of pages he preserved because he believed truth mattered, even when nobody seemed interested in hearing it. Standing there, I realized the ranch had given me more than an inheritance. It had given me a responsibility. Protecting land is not always about fences or property lines. Sometimes it is about preserving history long enough for the facts to find their voice. The cabins may have started this story, but they were never the real point. The real point was that ownership matters. Truth matters. And no matter how long it takes, land remembers who its rightful steward is. As the last light faded beyond the horizon, I looked across the ranch one final time and smiled. They built a business on my family's land. They forgot the land already had an owner.